First, I want to start with an incident from 2 years ago that has kind of thrust itself back into the news today. It was this moment back in 2023 when an armed and dangerous man showed up outside the home of a former president.
There's new information on the January 6th defendant arrested near the home of former President Barack Obama here in D.C.
After federal agents spotted and chased Taylor Taranto outside the D.C. home of former President Obama, they say they found these guns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a machete in Taranto's van parked nearby. The feds had already been trying to arrest Taranto for allegedly being part of the mob that attacked the Capitol January 6th, for which he faces 4 misdemeanor charges. Late today, federal prosecutors told a judge Taranto could have learned Obama's address from a social media post by former President Trump. They allege Trump posted what he claimed was Obama's address on his Truth Social platform, the same day Taranto was arrested near the home.
So that's a news reporting. This is all about a former January 6th rioter who showed up armed at the home of President Barack Obama right after Donald Trump had publicly posted Barack Obama's address online. And it's sort of astounding to think about how stories like that barely broke through when Trump was mounting his second bid for the White House. Former president possibly doxing another former president, posting his home address online, and then watching as one of his criminal supporters showed up at that address with a car full of weapons. That was scary and jarring and maddening, and it should have been a major scandal at the time. But of course, despite that incident and so much else, Trump was elected to a second term. And on his first day in office, he pardoned or commuted the sentences of every single one of the January 6 rioters, including the man just mentioned in that news reporting, Taylor Taranto, the man who showed up outside Barack Obama's home with a car full of guns and explosives. But even though Trump pardoned all those rioters for their January 6 related crimes, he did not pardon them for the other crimes they committed. And so even as Trump began firing DOJ officials and appointing his own loyalists to lead the agencies, prosecutors continued to pursue the case against Taranto related to his visit to former President Obama's home. And just this May, he was convicted on charges stemming from that incident that took place outside former President Obama's home. And believe it or not, his conviction was celebrated by none other than Trump's own handpicked U.S. Attorney, Jeanine Pirro, in one of her very first press releases on the job. You can see it there on the screen. So everyone was basically in agreement. It seemed that way. Even though Trump had pardoned this guy for what he did on January 6th, he was still criminally responsible for that second incident, making bomb threats and bringing firearms and explosives to the home of President Obama. Then prosecutors did what prosecutors are supposed to do. They drafted a sentencing memo explaining to the judge why Taranto should spend at least 27 months behind bars. And in that memo, they included these 2 short sentences about the man's criminal history. On January 6, 2021, thousands of people comprising a mob of rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol while a joint session of Congress met to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election. Taranto was accused of participating in the riot in Washington, D.C. by entering the U.S. Capitol building. That was it. Just 2 short sentences that acknowledged the riot at the Capitol happened, that it was carried out by a mob of angry rioters, and that Taranto was one of them. All factual details there. It is by any objective standard pretty relevant information for a criminal sentencing memo. But apparently something about that memo set off officials in the Trump White House. Because just hours after filing that sentencing memo today, the 2 prosecutors who wrote it were abruptly put on leave. The Trump administration then withdrew that sentencing memo, and they refiled a new one that not only removed all references to Trump posting Barack Obama's address online, a pretty pivotal key piece here, but also removed all the references to January 6th as well. So the circumstances here pretty clearly suggest that those 2 prosecutors are not only being punished for mentioning Trump's role in this case, they're being punished for accurately describing what happened on January 6th. Which, of course, is absurd given what we witnessed with our own eyes that day. I mean, if anything, describing the attackers as a mob of rioters is kind of an understatement. I mean, just a few years ago, members of Trump's very own party described the people who attacked the Capitol in much harsher terms.
The first thing that stands out to me is how embarrassed and disgusted I am that the United States Capitol could be taken over by domestic terrorists.
I had a lot of anger, as so many of my colleagues, that the Capitol got overrun, and these were anarchists and terrorists.
We are approaching a solemn anniversary this week, and it is an anniversary of a violent terrorist attack on the Capitol.
A violent terrorist attack. I mean, that was a year after January 6th. That was Ted Cruz, of course. Those were the words of Trump's allies. Maybe Trump is going to try to put those guys out of a job next once he realizes all of that. Who knows? Because now even calling January 6th a riot appears to be enough to get career prosecutors placed on extended leave from their jobs. Look, all we know that Donald Trump we all knew, of course, that Donald Trump would be fixated on seeking revenge against any and all government officials who he deemed to be his enemies. Typically, when people talk about Trump's retribution campaign, though, they talk about his pressure to bring criminal charges against people like Senator Adam Schiff and New York Attorney General Letitia James and former FBI Director James Comey. People who are well-known, who are in public roles or have been in the past. They talk about Jack Smith, who Trump said today should be investigated and put in prison. And those are definitely glaring examples, big ones, of Trump's revenge tour. But Trump's retribution campaign goes far beyond just trying to get current and former public officials thrown in jail. I mean, Trump is deploying federal troops to the streets of Democratic-led cities in what appears to be an attempt to punish voters in places where he got the least support. Just this week, he threatened to send troops into even more cities. And just tonight, the Wall Street Journal reports that the Pentagon is establishing a quick reaction force inside the National Guard so that Trump can deploy troops to any city he wants at any time. That is chilling. Trump has also used the shutdown fight to cancel infrastructure projects in Democratic congressional districts in order to punish even more people who didn't vote for him. Just last week, Trump approved disaster aid for 3 states he won in the last election, while denying disaster aid to 3 states he lost. Trump is engaging in a whole-of-government retribution campaign, basically using every lever of the federal government to target anyone in this country who he thinks is insufficiently loyal to him.